Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first Friday Food Systems Focus. I am Nicole Witham. I'm the statewide coordinator for the WSU Food Systems program. I help to organize and convene our WSU Food Systems team, which is a collection of WSU researchers, academics, and extension faculty and staff throughout the entire state, and as well as some of our critical partners like the Washington State Farmers Market Association, the WSDA, PCC Farmland Trust, TILF, and other counties and conservation districts throughout the state. This team collaborates to provide specialized resources for farmers and food systems contributors throughout Washington, working to support viable farm businesses, optimize sustainable natural resource stewardship, and to promote scaled processing and distribution. We do all of this work with the goal to pursue healthy and equitable access to food for everyone. So we frame this work that the food systems team and program are pursuing through our 7 focus areas. And these 7 focus areas are sustainable farming practices, equitable access, energy and waste management, processing and distribution, policy and regulation, economic benefit, and farmland and resource conservation. So today's presentation will be touching on a number of these elements. Before we get started and I hand things off to Stephen, I just want to go through some logistics. I want to kind of introduce everyone to the Blackboard Collaborate venue that we're using. So along the bottom of your screen, you will see a number of icons. There's one here where you can actually let us know if you'd like to tell us to speed things up or slow things down. That's an easy way of doing that. You can also raise your hand. And if you would like to ask a question throughout the presentation, I highly suggest using the chat box. That kind of just is an effort to keep things moving and to have less audio interruption. So on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a number of other icons, one of which is this little chat box. And you can click on that and feel free to type out a chat. I will be helping to moderate those questions for Stephen as he's presenting. And I think that's about it. So again, if you have any questions or any issues throughout, please feel free to send a chat as well, and I will be keeping track of those. So today's presenter is Stephen Bramwell. There he is, Stephen. He's hydrating. He's getting ready. Stephen is the director of WSU Thurston County Extension, and he's also a member of our food systems team. He's working to contribute. He also is a contributor to our Cascadia Grains Conference and is involved in some really interesting and exciting collaborations with breeders, growers, processors, and others that are involved in the specialty grains world for brewing and distilling. So thank you, Stephen, for coming, and I'm going to hand things off to him and let him introduce himself and what he's going to be talking about today.
Let's see, I'm going to share the screen here as a start. And is that visible now?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks, Nicole, for the introduction, and thanks, folks, for coming out and listening. This is the project that I'm going to present today, and probably one of the first times to start presenting some of this work. We've been at it for a couple growing seasons, and we've got some results coming in from last year and then from this year. So we're kind of starting to pull everything together. But the project, before I forget, among the 7 programming areas within the food systems team, it's probably most closely aligned with economic benefits, but it's certainly got some sustainable farming practices component as well. So this is our study here, ground to glass evaluation of barley varieties for craft malting, brewing, and distilling in Western Washington. I'm the presenter today, obviously, Stephen Bramwell. We have some co-PIs Kevin Murphy in the WSU breeding program. Tom Collins is at the WSU Wine Science Center in Richland, Washington. Research assistant of his is Leighton Ashmore, who's been helping Adam Peterson, research technician here in Thurston County. And then our farmers, Evan, Bill, and Brian at a couple different farms. And the Bourdon family at Sandstone Distillery are our partners in distillate production. Now we have some funding from the WSU BioAg program through Center for Sustaining Ag and Natural Resources. And then in 2018, this year, we kind of were able to stretch a 2-year project, a 1-year project into 2 years with some funding from the Port of Olympia that we got at the beginning, kind of end of last year, beginning of this year. So, I tried to follow the outline that the first Friday presentations are done on, so it follows that more or less. Kind of starting off, how's the program developed? I wanted to bring up our needs assessment that we did in the county in conducted in 2016 and got it written up and finished in 2017. But this provides a context for why we're doing what we're doing. We had a series of listening sessions in the county with farmers, held it around the county, kind of a traveling road show. We did some one-on-one consultations with farmers. And so these numbers are basically comments that are aggregated across all of our types of sessions, and then quantified as this bar graph and a line graph overlaid onto it. So R&E is research and education. I treat that a little bit differently in the interpretation of the needs assessment because it's a category that's pretty easily applied to all of the other subject-specific categories that farmers commented on. So while it received a lot of comments, it wasn't something that was subject-specific, so I kind of separated as important. Farmers are interested in networking events and more research information, more educational opportunities, more workshops. But these other 7 categories are topic-specific. So among those, the top 3 you see are grouped as market access, land and water, or otherwise access to productive resources, and regulations, or some kind of regulatory relief or assistance navigating regulatory limitations. Today's project is focused on the market access, and there's 2 parts to that. One is kind of the physical marketing resources like infrastructure, gaps in infrastructure that could help farmers get their product to market. The other more of a social oriented market access, so assistance with websites, with outreach, with educating consumers about products and pricing or other aspects to do with how much they know about products coming into the marketplace. And in that category, this grain project fits pretty well because a lot of what I hear is that farmers are interested in getting their product grown, but getting into a lucrative market. We live in a region in Western Washington at the south end of Puget Sound that's a pretty hot real estate market right now. And so anything that we can do in extension to help them add value to their crop is what they're really hungry for and want some help with. So in this instance, we're taking barley and looking at different varieties and then its suitability for a much higher value market as an ingredient in craft brewing and distilling. And hopefully the value of that would be higher than just selling on the commodity market. So that's how that fits in. How was the program developed? I went out to new faculty orientation when I was hired in 2016. I met with some folks I knew from graduate school. I attended WSU. Kevin Murphy was one of those people. I met with him and I said, Kevin, I need an idea for programming. What do you need? How can I help you in your program, and what can I do out of the extension office? Kevin simply said, grow a lot of barley for end-use evaluation. So I thought, okay, that's clear enough. We can get some funding and get some farmers and get some equipment, and we can grow a lot of barley. So that's what we set out to do. And then we had this question that was developing, and this is a recent headline in the New York Times. Can liquor have a local taste? They're banking on it. And then the subtitle there, no one is sure whether spirits can convey terroir like wine does, but distillers are seeking and selling that sense of place. And anybody involved with the Cascadia Grains Conference or just working with brewers and distillers or maltsters, there's definitely an emerging narrative that certain varieties or certain regions, varieties grown in certain regions, will impart those flavors onto the final product, whether it's beer, whether it's a spirit. And so the literature is growing, but it's definitely an open research field. So this became our kind of organizing question, and Kevin had an interest in evaluating some of his breeding lines for release of a variety that would be specifically suited by flavor, by agronomics, specifically for the kind of growing craft brewing and distilling industry. And then we needed to be able to analyze it, so we teamed up with Tom Collins. He's a distillate analysis expert at the WSU Wine Science Center. Here he is sniffing some of the first extraction from one of our whiskey barrels at Sandstone Distillery. And Tom's able to utilize GCMS analysis and sort out flavor compounds and then put on legitimate taste sensory evaluations as well. So we teamed up with him and he got involved with the project. Here's kind of the players. When we pitched this for our BioAg grant, we thought this was kind of an innovative research team. So here's our innovative research team. We put together a farmer, a couple farmers. Kevin is our breeder. Tom sometimes calls himself a boozologist, but distillate analysis expert sometimes gets wordy, so boozologist sometimes gets substituted. So we brought in the right folks who can do that work. Brewers and distillers, adding a maltster this season, and then extension personnel. And I guess I'm sort of a little bit of a glue bringing the team together, so that's kind of been my role. And then I was preparing for the presentation. I thought, you know, what's the team in the context of the food system? And certainly as this project has evolved, all these other partners, food system partners, have joined in. So like I mentioned earlier, we have funding from the port. A local land trust has got involved. They help us buy a piece of equipment that I'll talk about. EDCs have been involved, especially looking forward to develop some of the infrastructure in this area that would be helpful for serving the craft brewing and distilling industry. Conservation District helped out with some equipment purchase. Visitor and Convention Bureau, we're in discussion right now for putting on a community tasting. And so those have developed as our kind of wider community partners. And then certainly all this is oriented towards engaging the public so that they are bought in on that grain can be grown here, made into a product here, consumed here, and that we can have that link all the way through from the grower to the end user to the eventual end consumer. So I was thinking too about this presentation, and I thought of these two key elements. The food systems program involves many more than these two variables, but as I was kind of ruminating on this presentation, I thought, you know, these two elements have allowed us to create a program and then get a program we've been able to kind of mobilize from 1 year to 2 year, and then also gain a lot of interest. So asking a good question, this question of does barley variety have an effect on the end product, whether a spirit or a beer, and then something that can catch people's attention, and certainly craft brewing and distilling does. So all the other kind of food system components, the degree to which our project could be thought of as a food system project, I think has depended on these two things. A good question and something that catches people's attention, because whether it's putting together a research team that is fairly diverse or getting partners in the community that are fairly diverse, I think a good question and something that's interesting has been really critical. So just wanted to kind of put that up as food for thought. These are our goals, still in kind of program development mode here. We wanted to identify barley varieties with good agronomic characteristics, high yields, and disease resistance in our area of Western Washington. We wanted to generate a volume of barley so we had enough for the end use evaluations that Kevin was interested in and that we're all interested in now. We wanted to determine whether cultivar affects flavor in new make craft spirits. And that's expanded recently to look at aged whiskey, because we'll have it, so we can analyze it. So we have whiskey in barrels right now. And then we want to do a couple more outward-facing things with the community, demonstrating the contributions that grain production and processing can make to the local economy. So I'm doing that with some outreach events and showing that our farmers can sell into this kind of burgeoning industry, and that can contribute to our local economy and create jobs. And then build public understanding of local grain production and processing. So not a lot of people are familiar with grain production in this area. Trying to get them out into the field, some of the brewers, some of the distillers, some decision makers, port personnel, and then reciprocally trying to get some of our growers into in front of some of these end users and getting them familiar with distillation, with malting, with brewing, and getting them in contact with our decision makers as well, and some people who could finance some of the infrastructure that we need. Program development, not really an exhaustive list, but some high points of what we've done, some of our at least broad brushstroke methods. We reached out for some funding. We got funding from the BioAg program in that amount, and we got a second year funding from the Port of Olympia. I reached out and got an undergraduate internship to help, an intern to help this year with some of the survey work that got established as a kind of a result of the barley variety trials. So we started adding the survey component. Of course, lots of costs to cover, so creating some budgets, hiring custom hire farmers, working with distilleries, supplies, research technician, analytical costs. That last one is probably one of the more expensive areas. Worked with a couple field farmer cooperators, one out in Montesano, Washington, and then one in Adna, Washington in 2017 and 18, respectively. We had our field scale trials out in Montesano, 6-acre plots, 9 varieties, totaling about 4.5 acres. And then that was year 1. Then year 2 expanded to 6 acres up to 7 with alleys. And we reduced the number of varieties from 9 to 4 and increased the area that each variety was grown on. Worked with Sandstone in years 1 and 2. They made the distillate. And then we're going to work with them again this year for the harvest. We got a Malta brewer cooperators. We're going to be ending up working with, we don't know who yet, but a malting operation in Western Washington or Central Washington. And then I've mentioned Tom is on the team, so they're doing the analysis over in Richland. And then local community tasting, looking to do some tasting at the Cascadia Grains Conference this winter. And then with the Visitor and Convention Bureau for more of a dedicated local community outreach event, either at the end of this year or beginning of next year. So that's a lot of words. I figured I'd put up some pictures because it's been a fun project. I think food systems work takes you into the community, into the fields. You get to interact with a lot of partners, and this has been a lot of fun. And so we've taken photos along the way. Here's our initial seed. In 2017 we got from Kevin, and my mom drove that from Seattle down to Olympia because that's part of this, just an odd point in the connection. It's been a project that's been a lot of bootstrapping, and I think we shouldn't be afraid of that. So whether it's equipment or funding or community connections, all that has to be put together in creative ways. So there's Evan seeding. We got a crop coming up in that picture as well. That's actually a 2018 crop germinating down in Adna. The top one is seeding in Montesano. Here's our Adna plots from early in the season through to harvest, which was just a few weeks ago. Just kind of track that from a spot. And I've tried to use images and posters and Facebook posts and newsletters and high resolution, good quality images to capture people's attention. So I think when we're doing food system work too, it's important that we're trying to communicate our work in ways that capture people's imagination. And certainly, at least some nice photos have been helpful in that respect, and a good marketing strategy for letting people know about what we do. We had some good harvests, moved those harvests around. We ended up with a really weedy crop in 2017, and so some of our community partners started joining when it got to the point where we need forklifts, we need trailers, flatbed trailers, we need barns. And the cool thing is that those partners have kind of emerged at the points at which we needed them, and because they were interested and they believe that we should do what we can to keep farmers farming and get their product into the marketplace. So here's us towing a grain cleaner that we bought from a farmer out of his garage that hadn't been used for many years. That's an old clipper. We drove that through Chehalis and up to a barn site, moving things around with all of our 27 varieties from plots. or 27 plots from 9 varieties in 2017 in the upper right. Lots of breakdowns and repairs having to be done. Always a little bit tense, but certainly a fun part of the overall process. We've had pretty interesting weather in 2017. We were harvesting right as the smoke blew in heavy from fires that summer, and it was really hard for our crop in Montesano to dry down. We get coastal fog in the morning. It's only about 10 miles from Aberdeen and Grays Harbor. And then by the afternoon, that was clearing off, but then we had this smoke that was already there to begin with or moved in. So we had a little bit of grain that was on the moist side. It was fine for getting into the distillery for use because we could use it fairly quickly, so it didn't have to sit too long. But in keeping seed from 2017 to 18, we had to dry that down. So that's a key piece of infrastructure on the small scale for seed for plots. You can do that even half-acre plots just with those Rubbermaid totes in the upper left. So some manifolds and totes, or rubber totes that can each hold about a little under 200 pounds of seed, rigging up some drying capacity there. We had some bovine observers. In the bottom left is the distillery. And fortunately, again, some food system partners have this key infrastructure, like how do you weigh a tote full of grain? I mean, I'm not equipped to do that out of the extension office, but there are people in the community who still have that equipment, so we could. And they're getting those scales tested regularly, so they're good weights that we can trust. So fortunately, our distillery had a really nice floor scale. The farmer this year has a nice floor scale. Middle bottom is a kind of combined cooker distiller at Sandstone Distillery. Some of the product in the bottom right, and just as an indication of the overall fun, you can't really see it, but if you can see the absolute joy on Adam's face watching that barley crop come in out of the combine. It's priceless. So we had fun along the way, and it's really great working with grains. I've not done a lot of it. I really enjoyed it, and then had some real beautiful crops. So here's our crop in 2018, and this is just after our field day in 2018 that farmers and Cascadia Grains folks came out to and co-sponsored that with the Cascadia Grains Conference, that field day, and ABBA came down. And so that was real beautiful, and even a little bit of smoke haze this season, but it was so much drier that the crop was not. It was really in good condition for harvesting, so a lot lower moisture contents. And then our overall stakeholders, certainly farmers, certainly the craft beverage industry, certainly public finance entities that would like to potentially invest in facilities if those facilities are needed. They're interested in economic development, and part of Port Authority is to create economic development opportunities, and it's a pretty blanket authority in capacity that ports have. So they oftentimes, to get good press, to demonstrate they're doing good things for the community, are looking for opportunities for investing and even funding studies. I mean, the port's essentially funding a variety trial in 2018. Now it's under the rubric of product development. But most of the expenses are trial-related expenses, so it's been interesting working with them and figuring out how we can use those local funds. County government is certainly a stakeholder for economic development, and they've been very supportive. Local agritourism, industry, and entities like visitor and convention bureaus are good partners. They want to see more visitor travel throughout their areas that they work. And then in Olympia and Tumwater, the Tumwater Craft Brewing and Craft Beverage District has been developing. Folks are trying to renew and rehabilitate the old Olympia Brewery, and so the folks at the city of Tumwater have been really helpful just in terms of outreach, helping to get the word spread about the project, and just another good community partner. And our audience is all those people plus end consumers, and so doing outreach events that can draw in the public and get them excited about putting their money into products that use local ingredients is really our end goal, and our really kind of, I guess, maybe most important ultimate audience, because we need to get that dollar to be translated through to the buyer so that farmers can get a little more money. So where our goals reached, just kind of moving into some of the outcomes of the project. Some of them yes, and some of them are still in progress. So, hey Nicole, just as a comment, do you want any questions along the way, or should we just go through and wait till the end?
I think so far just keep on going. I've been watching the chat. If anybody have any questions or just any kind of follow-up comments or anything before Stephen continues, feel free to write a chat in the box or unmute yourself from the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, chime in if there are any.
Sounds like you're good to go, Stephen. We'll definitely take some time at the end for discussion as well.
Okay, great. So were our goals reached? Like I said, kind of, it seems, yeah, for the most part, and then some that are still going. Those would be the only ones that we're still working on. But I'll just kind of tick through some of those, some of the results, the product of our goals. Interestingly, in our area, we monitored rust religiously last year and this year, like 0 rust incidents at all last year, so we just weren't able to evaluate for it. This year we started seeing rust at the end of the year, but we didn't get to any type of stage that it could be evaluated evenly across the field, so it's just a little here and a little bit there. And so that's not anything that we're contributing to. Now, it's also important to mention that a lot of the varieties, well, all the varieties that we're working with are breeding lines minus the control in the barley breeding program at WSU. So those have already gone through plot evaluation in other parts of the state, and so rust evaluations of those have already been done. It was something that we wanted to look at for sure here if we could, but we also knew that our goal was really volume and some field scale yield estimations, and that would be compatible and complementary to some of the other kind of more maybe like ability to monitor those crops better at the plot scale, and also to have full rust impact at plot scales where that could be evaluated. So that data is out there for these varieties. The other thing to note that I didn't earlier is that one of the potential outcomes that we hope for, if there's varieties that are deemed kind of worthy, is that there would be a release of one of these varieties specifically suited for crop brewing and distilling, so kind of a crop brewing and distilling barley for Western Washington. And that's been Kevin's ongoing goal for this work, and we're just supporting that project. So yield was in 2017. This is, I don't need to go into great details. This is kind of a food systems project on the results, but they were competitive. So the varieties did well in the field. Farmers kind of walked through the fields. They had their favorites. Things looked good. Yields were competitive but low in year 1, and they're competitive and high in year 2. So we had a site with lower weed pressure and a little bit better soil preparation in year 2. And so we're just able to, and I think just a little bit overall fertility levels, we upped the fertilizer rates, and so had a much better ability to kind of compare yields in year 2 than year 1. But we don't have that yield data yet for yield 2. In year 1, they were all in the 1 to 1.5 tons per acre range. No lodging in either year, and we have some grain quality data on the next slide. Top 3 year varieties over yielded. The control in year 1, and then this goal of generating volume, we started off per variety with 50 pounds of seed, and we're up to 4,000 pounds at the end of this year per variety. So able to do kind of just achieve that objective of having something to work with. So across 4 varieties, I think we actually have more than 4,000 pounds. I think we have 4 tons per variety. But at any rate, the total yield is, if the math might be a little off, but our total barley quantity coming out of year 2 is 24,000 pounds across 4 varieties, 3 breeding lines, and Copeland as a control. And so we'll have that yield data once we can weigh those out. They're all still in totes at the moment in the farm down in Adna. So here's just a little bit of grain quality evaluation. We sent all of this grain samples over to the Hartwick Center for Craft Brewing, Distilling, and Malting out of Hartwick, New York. And so Aaron McLeod is the fellow we work with there. There's 10 varieties here because we basically have two controls. There's Muir and there's Copeland. Copeland was added as a kind of a second control in the course of the project because it's an industry standard for malting barley. And so we added that into the mix, and it was also the barley that the cooperator in Montesano the first year was already growing, so it was relatively easy to add as control because the plots were all surrounded in that. And then we kind of swapped out Muir in year 2 and just stuck with Copeland. So the orange is like sort of a bar for the quality we're shooting for, and yellows are the varieties that we advanced for the most part from year 1 to year 2, 117-17, 120-14, and 120-17, the bottom two, and then 117-17 in the middle, and Copeland on the top. So for folks who are interested in kind of diving deeper on interpreting these numbers, it's probably not the best audience right now to kind of go into each of those, but you can dig into that and look up these values. You can kind of see that they're at least comparable. Lower numbers are a little better on, or sorry, over 150 is good on RVA. I think close to 100 on germ energy is what you're shooting for. You're certainly looking for plump kernels, and the moisture contents were at the field when harvested, so it just gives at least an indication of the comparability of how well those different varieties and breeding lines dried down on a kind of a wet year. So this goal of end-use evaluation, this is where the craft spirits and brewing industry really gets kind of fun and controversial, where people on either side argue vehemently that the grain does impart flavor, the grain doesn't impart flavor, and where this is a really exciting area to work in. So whether you dig into some of the research that's coming out or some of the popular press stuff about different distilleries working on kind of marketing their product on the basis of flavor, there's a lot of opinions that are invoked when this flavor question comes up. So Tom and Leighton, this is one of their very early analyses. They're still working on all this. They have a lot more to do, but all the variation that are non-varietal is along the x-axis, so left to right. So there's a greater portion of the variation in the final make that's due to non-varietal factors. And so 56% of the variation in the new make whiskey in this case is non-varietal. And then the varietal related variation is on the y or vertical axis. So you're seeing decent separation, but a smaller portion of the overall variability, at least in this analysis, due to the variety. So we're getting early results that are showing that we're seeing differences. 20% of those are associated with variety in the new make whiskey. Others are distillation factors, such as the proof, the proof of the final product, and some other factors of the distillation process, and not the variety. And the 3 varieties we chose, the breeding lines we chose to go forward from 17 to 18 are the ones that are actually, this is more by luck than planning, but are 120-14, 120-17, and 117-17. So they have some of the larger separation on that kind of Y and vertical axis, which bodes well, because if we're trying to sort out flavor differences, then we're going to see that those have some good potential of showing some flavor differences. All 9 varieties went into barrels at Sandstone Distillery at the end of 2017, but this analysis is on new make before the product went into the barrels. Here's a couple other initial analyses by Tom and Leighton. You got the larger differences are due to yeast byproducts, ethanol, heat in the distillation process. So these major compounds and the major differences in the analysis are these fatty acid ethyl esters. And then the minor compounds, which would be those due to the plant products, are circled in small circles on the bottom. alcohols, aldehydes, yeast products, and terpenes of the plant products. So those are kind of what we're trying to hone in on. Is they're a little harder to sort out because they're not as prominent. They don't make a prominent difference between the products, but that's what Tom and Leighton need to dig into. And good reason for teams on projects like this is they would be able to interpret this and maybe provide a little more background than I can, and that's certainly their area of expertise. But I wanted to put up some slides that show some of the initial results from their work. There's one more here, and I'm not going to make any attempts at interpreting this, but I find it interesting. And Leighton, I asked if he wanted me to present anything more, and so he sent a couple more figures. And this is actually an analysis on a steep of the grain of each of the varieties. So I sent him out some raw barley, and these are all from 2017. And so he did some steeps and some analysis to sort out different compounds. And so this is some initial distribution of different compounds and the different varieties and how they basically overlay in this figure. And like I said, I'm not going to make any attempts here to start to draw conclusions about which compounds are in which one and which ones of these might be fruity or spicy or anything else. So hopefully we'll get there, and that's the direction that we're moving in, because each of these compounds will probably have something that can be pinned to a sensory analysis. At least some of them can be. And then our final two goals were this to show or to demonstrate contributions of grain to the local economy, and then the last goal from the previous slide was to increase public understanding of opportunities and constraints for getting barley into and other grains into kind of high value end products. And so the main things that we're wanting to do are on the left. We want to highlight farmers and make sure that their product isn't lost in this rush to craft beverages, but raw ingredients are not included. And certainly, as hops have demonstrated, people are eager to see that. And I think it seems as though malt and malting barley is maybe like another horizon for people to be aware of. We want to look at and increase market potential of these grains and get them into different products. We want to get data generated so that folks can use it in the malting and in brewing and distilling industry. And we want end users to be able to know where grains come from and have some literacy around those grains and the impact of those grains in final products. We want to share that data with everybody, and then certainly engage the public. And so the list on the right is the way that we are accomplishing those goals through field days, presentations, malting barley, extension bulletin, community tasting events, craft spirits used for fundraisers, and buyer grower survey, which is an emerging activity. This is a little duplicative of the last list, but it's maybe just a concise listing of our actions to implement the program, and it was one of the kind of guidelines for our outline here. We had a funding initiative, a couple years of variety trials, a couple field days, a lot of networking around the community, both with a research team and in the local community, in a regional community, then product making, product testing, analytical work. Some efforts along the way, this infrastructure development, and then we're starting to do some market research as an action of this program that's spun off from the initial funding. Community collaboration. This is it's been a great project because it has involved so many different groups and people, and some colorful personalities as well. And so John and Justin are there at Sandstone Distillery. They've been really great. They tackled distilling 9 varieties of barley last winter and trying to fit that around their other schedule and their other products. That's their dog Barley sitting on barley. And they're given we're unloading and weighing barley in this photo, and then there's just a list of folks who are partners and who have helped out. So I think it's worth putting those up because it shows that our work that we do that's food system related can have this really wide reach, and people get interested if it's a good question, and it catches their attention. So ports, conservation districts, farmland trusts, I want to mention them in particular because they are interested in using some of their property for barley storage, a possible mill. They've let us use a big barn for free because they believe in the project. I mean, some of their initial funding had educational component to it, so that's also where we host the Friday field track for the Cascadia Grains Conference. One of their members of the land trust contributed money to help buy the grain cleaner just as a personal contribution. The conservation district chipped into that, buying that grain cleaner because they'd like to do educational outreach and possibly own a grain cleaner at one point, so that could be equipment that they lease or rent. And I've mentioned VCBs. They want to do a tasting event, craft brewery district in Tumwater. The community college has been very interested and helpful because they're starting a new craft brewing and distilling program. NABC has gotten involved recently, and then some group of great Lewis and Grays Harbor farmers have joined in, and then EDCs and farm bureaus. A little overview of the timeline. I think people can pick up, based on what I've said so far, how this has been laid out, but we had a couple years of research trials. We're thinking about a third year, and then the project, whether it's expanding or finishing, it's kind of still expanding because we got this additional funding to start doing market assessments because the ports of both Chehalis and Olympia are interested in possible grain storage and grain processing infrastructure they could finance and then rent. And so we're doing a buyer and a grower surveys to help that process. And this is just one piece of initial feedback on that. This pie chart, the growers have unmet storage needs, and 3/4 do. And one of the problems is that if we can't even begin to store the grain in Western Washington, we can't sell it in other parts of the year. And so it's depressing actual production in our area, the fact that we just don't have a place even to put it, to then distribute it out to people who might be interested in buying it from the growers. So there's been a really involved group of grain growers in the last few months. That's been nice to see. That's kind of been a spin-off of these trials. And then overall impact on the food system. The investment from the initial bioag funding, we were able to leverage that with some funding from the port. There's been some kind of beginning infrastructure development at the land trust, like I've mentioned, and then purchases of some other equipment, grain cleaner, grain dryer, augers, and bins. We have a really great mechanic who's helped out with the project, who also distributes and applies lime for one of the local farm stores, and so he's always visiting farms and spots old equipment. And so as people hear what we're doing, they want to try to find ways they can help. And so this person has found that they can find equipment, and then we can try to find money to get it. We've got this farmer advisory group that started. Then there's some scoping of investment at the Port of Chehalis for a rail to truck transfer and large-scale grain storage, so that we could get grain down to malting facility in Vancouver, up to malting facilities in the Skagit, and then to brewers around the area. And then there's buyer interest demand. I just put up another little piece of results from our recent survey. We've got about 20 buyers interviewed so far, mostly brewers, and then this is their interest in buying locally grown grain, and they're either very, quite, somewhat, hardly, or not interested. And so most of them are in this, 65% area or somewhat. So there's a good amount of interest, and then would they pay more for local grain? 17 out of 18, the point at which we were at in the survey at that time, said they would, and they estimated on average they'd pay 17% more than they could get it from their current non-local markets. So the impacts are really just kind of very initial. I'd say this hasn't had a whole lot other than people getting organized and involved in the project. And then we're looking for those long-term impacts that could be in infrastructure and increased sales. So I think time will tell on all the rest of those things. And then this is, I think, the second to the last slide, some lessons learned. I put up institutional networking. That initial question that I asked Kevin led to this whole thing, and it's been interesting to me to see how that happens. And then reading the WSU e-newsletters is what led me to Tom Collins, because he was doing distillate analysis. So we have a lot of, well, that's actually the fourth or fifth bullet there. Our colleagues are doing cool shit. So they are, and we should ask them what they're doing and what they can do to help us. So I really highly encourage that. ask colleagues what they need. The needs assessment has been really useful. I'm kind of surprised to see that's been, I mean, maybe not surprised it's been useful, but I'm pleased that it has been. Pitch the value of research in the community. That's our strength. That's definitely something I've learned. The food systems work is kind of a crowded field, or feels like a crowded field sometimes. Within communities, everybody wants to get involved in food and farming work, and I found that what's been most compatible and our biggest strength is the value of bringing rigorous research into the community. Do what's needed, not just what's comfortable. That's just by way of saying I didn't know we'd get involved in craft brewing and distilling work, and it's not something I'm familiar with, but it's been needed, and so I've been willing to kind of explore, and I think it's going pretty well. And then seek local funds. I've mentioned how that's worked out with a port, and that's been really a nice, they've been a great partner. And then the Port of Chehalis is jumping in right now, and they're like hugely motivated. So there's some good local funds to be identified and chased. And then share, collaborate, pay partners well and on time, hire help. And by means of it works, I mean, this process of kind of identifying a need and chasing it through and building partners and funding is a new person to Extension. I didn't know how that would all unfold. And it's been fun to kind of be on that ride. It's been a good one, and it's kind of worked just by trying to do each of those steps well enough along the way. So that is the last of my lessons learned. We've got at least 10 minutes before the turn of the hour, so if there's any questions, happy to field any of those.
Thank you, Stephen. That's awesome. I just wanted to just double check and ask, you mentioned mainly the variety trails that you're using. Are those all going into distilling for this round, or was there any brewing that happened as well? So did you primarily work with sandstone?
Yeah, for year one it was distilling, and then the goal for year two is to get enough more volume that we could go with sandstone again, but then also, and the neat thing about sandstone is that they use enzymes for their distillation, so that we didn't have to malt it. So it was easy to work with them directly, just bring them the grain, and it also reduces a variable in flavor analysis if it hasn't gone through a malting process, if they use enzymes to activate the conversion process. And so that's what they did. Year two, we have enough volume to get it malted with a partner malt facility, and then it's envisioned that will go to 2 different brewers, maybe one over in Pullman or Moscow area, and then one more locally in kind of the South Puget Sound.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. And some of the funding kind of effort that we're working on right now is that we're probably going to end up with some unfunded analytical costs that we need to do some fundraising for. So we'll have the product, we just need to get enough money to get to Tom and his crew to run the analysis in Richland.
And I'm not sure if you mentioned this outrightly at the beginning of your presentation, but something that I think is interesting about this work, and that maybe you could touch on a little bit more, is the fact that you're actually doing this in an organic no spray system as well.
Yeah, year one was all organic production. And then in year two, we have it's a conventional system, but it's a no spray.
Mm-hmm.
And the interest there was that we could try to see how, I mean, easily 85% of the growers in our area are growing conventionally. In a recent survey, 1/3 of them suggested they would grow organic grain, but I wanted to do something that would demonstrate the productivity potential in conventional production, but with no spray, to keep at least an element of the kind of biologically intensive component. So we went in with really good weed control in that year, in our second year.
And what type of growers do you think are the most interested in this work? Is it existing farmers? Is it new and beginning farmers? Is it transitional farms that are changing generations, different things like that?
Well, I haven't thought about that. It's a good question. certainly it's most immediately relevant to our existing growers because they're the ones with not exactly totally fallow acreage, but untapped growing potential that if they could get a good market, they would grow more. And we saw there's some definitely price-related pent-up interest in production. So that's the immediate market. And it's really hard for new growers to get into grain production because it takes so much acreage. So, I mean, while I think it's neat for new farmers to have as a component of an overall farming system, it would have to be a broader part of what they do, using grain as a crop rotation, but having a market that would make it so that crop actually paid for itself. If it didn't give them a lot of money, at least would cover the pest control and other kind of agronomic benefits they could get out of it. There's some background noise, but hopefully that was understandable. Somebody's got
Doug,
their
did you
mic
have a
on
question?
driving down the freeway.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. This is great. I have a bunch of questions. I had thoughts about weeds, and I wasn't going to ask about them, but since you brought it up, if you could elaborate a little bit more on the weed control, especially in organic and no spray. And then my other question is, if you could just explain a little bit more. I do like to drink whiskey, but I don't really know a lot about how it gets from the field to the glass. And I know there's this component of aging it and all of that. So, how does that whole process? It seems very challenging to me to do research on something where oftentimes people are aging it to make it better or whatever. So I don't know if you could just touch on that part of the making process and like how does the science, how can you step in and learn things about it?
Right. Yeah, good. Yeah, on the weed control, weed management, organic weed management in grain is pretty challenging. It was a really weedy site in year one, and that's a site that grows grains organically, mostly for an organic hog operation. So the income really comes from bacon sold at farmers markets in Seattle, but they lower their overall costs by growing grain. So then it was easy for us to kind of loop in this field trial out there, organic site, history of organic management, but the weed pressure was really high. So your primary opportunity is either rotation, going in with a smaller weed seed bank, or else then you have the pre-emergence or within the first 10 days tine weeding, and you can usually get 2 or 3 passes through the field. So I think in the case of the first farmer, if for long-term weed management, they're going to need to diversify what they're doing, or have enough land to take certain years off to let seeds come up and then reintegrate them into the ground. In a no spray system, it's a nice fit really for a lot of grain growers around here because, like I said, the majority are conventional. Something that I learned is being done in central and eastern Washington for the linkage of the farmer to the malter to the distiller and brewer, that Link Foods has helped to create, is that they're deliberately growing no spray crops, and so they'll manage their system for several years in conventional production, and then the year they're going to grow a particular crop because they think they'll have a better marketing potential as a no spray. My understanding is then they'll eschew spray in that particular season, and then it ties in with an overall production management system of emphasizing reduced or no tillage in the hilly parts of central and eastern parts of the state. So there it seems like they're just emphasizing the need to keep soil on the hill, so it's the better approach is with this no spray system involved with a reduced tillage system. So in the broader scheme of things, integrating grains into crop rotation, I think it's always cited, but I never find a lot of research on grains and vegetable rotation. So it's like I cited it for funding for this project, but it's like, truth be told, there's not a lot of literature that are looking at grains in cropping systems. So I think there's a good opportunity there, Doug, at the Puyallup Research Station. So that's the part one. The whiskey, barley's harvested, and then there's some post-harvest handling, like removal of weed seeds, testing for mycotoxins, making sure the moisture content is at a right level that it's going to be stored for a while, so you don't end up with quality reduction issues or mycotoxin growth or just reduced germination issues. So you want to have a nice clean crop. You want to have a crop that's, between probably 11 and 13% moisture, for storage for a decent amount of time. And then from there, you're ready to work with a malting facility, get it to that malting facility. If you work with distilleries, sometimes use enzymes, so it doesn't have to be malted. They pitch enzymes into the cooker, and that, essentially provides the enzymatic conversion, from the starches to the sugars, which will then turn into alcohol. So from malting, at that point, it's shelf stable. You can have, pallets of 50-pound sacks of malted barley because it's all nice and dried down. It's been essentially germinated and then steeped and germinates, and then it's roasted. So the enzymes have been activated for that conversion of starch to sugar, and they've been converted over largely. I think I'm not a malter or a maltster. And so at that point, though, that's what most brewers and distilleries are using, is the malted end product. So the role or our opportunities to join it at any point of that process, I think, are, the entry point we found was, it was kind of nice to have a distillery that used enzymes, because it eliminated the malting as a variable. But at any points in the process, I think you can test that product or evaluate that product. You can evaluate the grain in terms of how well what its grain and malt quality is, and so you can send off grain samples to the Hartwick Center and have those analyzed. OSU has a micro malting facility, so you can grow grain and send to them to be micro malted. Most of the malt analysis happens in Oneonta, New York. I think I called it Hartwick, New York earlier, but it's Oneonta. And then at any stage of the process, you could have something made or partner with a brewery or distiller or maltster and kind of pull off product. And then if it's flavor that's of interest to us, working with the right person like Tom Collins to do, compound analysis or do tastings. At the Cascadia Grains Conference East, they did a really large tasting of steeped malt. And so just some public tastings are things that can be done. That can be corroborated with lab work or tastings with trained tasting panels. And then the final product, I think, is a little trickier because you have the aging component of oak in barrels. And so the further you go to a final aged product, the harder it is to trace differences back to the actual ingredient. So in a nutshell, the earlier you are in the process, the easier it is, at least for flavor analysis.
So if you're tasting it, is the distillate like very early?
Yeah, that's what Tom and Leighton have been evaluating, the unaged product before it went into the barrels, post distillation, pre-aging. But we have product in barrels that we'll evaluate as well. It'll just potentially be harder to separate out barrel compounds from plant compounds.
So the graph you showed with the F1 and F2, were those flavors, or was that like
those? Yeah, that kind of dives a little deeper. Like, I've gotten minimal explanation on that, but they're basically just tracing back any type of variation that could be due to the actual barley varieties on the y-axis, and anything that's more obviously due to distillation conditions on the x. And I'm not sure how they make that distinction, in all honesty. And so they just did that this summer and had the data pulled together for the field day.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. We're at the end of our hour. I have one little plug to share with everyone, just a little save the date for the Cascadia Grains Conference, which is going to be in January in the Olympia area. A lot of the work that Stephen is doing, and his partners and a lot of other folks that are working within the kind of green economy are usually present for the conference, and it's looking like it's going to be some really cool tastings going on this year as well, including some hot steep malt analysis and some other things. So there's a little plug for that. Hopefully you can join us. Feel free to reach out to myself, Stephen, or others to learn more. And just so everyone is aware, this is a recorded session that will be going live on our WSU Food Systems YouTube channel for those that were not able to view live. And so thanks again, Stephen. Have a great weekend, everybody. And
Thank you.
Please join us again sometime.